Good morning. Thanks for all coming out this morning. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Oh, that's even better. Okay, well, I hope you can all hear me. If you can't, let me know. Okay, so we're going to talk about ISIS this morning. And when we think about ISIS, these are the sorts of images that might come to mind. We think about fighters under black banners. I looked at our napkins this morning and thought, I wonder if they got black ones for ISIS for us. We think about them enslaving Yazidi women. Sometimes the pictures are a little closer to home, the bombings in Paris, or even closer, we think about the knife attacks in the Crossroads Mall. And so the question that arises, and the question that we hear people asking in the media is there something in Islam that has allowed this to arise? Is ISIS inherently Islamic, as they certainly claim to be, or is it an aberration? Is it something that really is counter to the mainstream of Islamic thought? So that's a question for this morning. And to attack that question, I think we need to ask, well, what is a religion? What gets to define what a religion is? How might we go about doing this? So I've put up on the screen 4 possible ways that we might look at this question of who gets to define a religion? What is a religion? So we could first say, well, it's what a central authority says it is. Or we could say it's what the adherents to that religion say and do. We could say, well, it's the spirit or intent of an early founder. Or we might finally say it's what's written in a sacred text for those religions that have a sacred text. So we're going to look at all 4 of these possibilities as they pertain to Islam and to ISIS. So let's start with number 1. Number 1's going to be easy. A central authority. I imagine most of you in this room are Catholic, and you have a central authority, the Pope and the Vatican. And that is actually in many ways, I know that there are people who are going to say, yeah, but in many ways it's a strength for a religion, at least in terms of being able to say, what is beyond the pale? We don't have that in Islam. There is no central authority. In fact, Islam is one of the least hierarchical religions on the planet. There aren't priests. I suppose in some ways it's comparable to Judaism. You have imams, but the imam is basically a prayer leader, a teacher, that's all. Not a priest in any special sense. You have sometimes figures like the Ayatollah in Iran, but in general, there isn't a strong hierarchical structure in Islam. So there is no central authority that can proclaim whether ISIS is or is not a part of the religion. Now, one of the questions that people ask, and I'm just going to bring this up right away, is, well, why aren't Muslims speaking out against ISIS? How come we don't hear anything? And the thing is, actually, they are. Okay, there was a proclamation that came out about a year ago with a whole list of reasons why ISIS is not Islamic. It was signed by over 100 major Islamic leaders around the globe. Did you ever hear about it on the evening news? No. Exactly. Okay, we're going to come back to the role of the media later. But they are, but you're not hearing about it. So central authority, no. Are there authorities? Are there scholars? Are there imams? Yes. Are they speaking out? Yes, but you're not hearing it. Okay, what the adherents say and do. This would be probably the place where we could have the strongest claim for ISIS to be Islamic, because you could simply say, well, they claim to be Islamic, so it's Islamic. Okay, but the problem of judging any religion by what the adherents say and do is you have to ask the question, which adherents? Okay, who are you going to go by? In Islam, you've got ISIS on one hand, you've got a lot of other adherents on the other hand saying, this does not represent me, this does not represent what I believe. You know, any more than we might say, well, you know, does the Ku Klux Klan represent Christianity? Well, we don't think so, but if they call themselves Christian, do we say, well, now you're Christian? So to just say, well, because people in ISIS call themselves Muslims, they're Muslim, yes, in a sense. Every religion has to acknowledge its dark side, okay? But also, well, is this a majority of adherents? So let's look at what the majority say. And here, this is kind of small in this room, but this is the results of a Pew Research Center study where they simply asked, is your view of ISIS, or do you have a blank opinion of the Islamic militant group in Iraq and Syria known as ISIS? The orange bars are unfavorable, is the answer. The really dark slivers are favorable, and the gray is didn't answer or didn't know or, you know, somehow didn't answer the question. So as you can see, this is countries ranging from Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Palestine, Indonesia, Turkey, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, down to Pakistan. The only, actually no country has anywhere close to a majority favorable opinion of ISIS. In fact, I think, well, 14 is the highest number in Nigeria, but that's balanced against 66% who have an unfavorable opinion. Okay, so if you say, well, majority rules, what do the majority of Muslims say? The majority of Muslims say, this is not Islam. This is not my Islam. I don't have a favorable opinion of what's going on here. Okay, but I think for us, we're probably going to fare better if we go down to 3 and 4. So let's return to the start and take a brief history through how Islam got started, what Muhammad had in mind, what we find in the earliest teachings, and then take a look at the Qur'an and what we actually find in the Qur'an, and see if those give us a stronger sense of where ISIS stands within this religion. So we start with Muhammad. Muhammad was born in Mecca in 570. And he was orphaned by the age of 5. Both of his parents were dead before he had turned 5. This is actually an important point. You're going to see this as a formative thing in his view of the world and in his view of what was important. Now, the Arabian Peninsula at this time, in terms of religion, was the majority of the people in the peninsula were basically polytheists. And the Meccans in particular, Muhammad was born into the main tribe within Mecca. This was the tribe that controlled pretty much the commerce and the banking. You know, these were the Wall Street folks of Mecca. Their name was the Quraysh. He was born into a small sort of sub-tribe of this major tribe that was in charge. Now, the Quraysh were primarily polytheists. They not only ran the commerce in the town, but they also ran the Kaaba. And the Kaaba was a pilgrimage site that predates Islam. Inside the Kaaba at this time, there were 360 different idols, statues to different gods and goddesses. You see, the Meccans were kind of equal opportunity polytheists. And so anytime they would come, and because they were traders, they came in contact with a lot of different people. And each time they'd come in contact with somebody else, and they would say, well, we worship so-and-so. They'd say, great, you know, give us a statue. We'll put it in the Kaaba, and why don't you come for a pilgrimage and spend some money while you're in Mecca? So they had 360 statues inside the Kaaba, and simply believed that anybody's god or goddess could take up residence there. There were also Christians in the Arabian Peninsula at the time, and most of the Christians there were Monophysite Christians. Now, Monophysite, if it's a Greek term, you think first mono, we all know that one, it's one, okay. Physite comes from physis, it's body, nature, one being, okay. So these were Christians who believed that Jesus had only one nature. And for many of them, that nature was human. And so they didn't accept that Jesus was fully human and fully divine at the same time. This was not unusual around 600, and many of the, when we say the Nicene Creed a bit earlier, but they were fighting the same battles further west of, what exactly was the nature of Jesus. So this too, I think, is somewhat formative in what we find in Islam. There were also Jewish tribes that had been Arabicized, and there were several of these tribes living around there. Politically, as I just mentioned, tribe, it was a very tribal system. Everybody lived within their own tribe, which was governed by blood, by heredity. Each tribe would be governed by a sheikh, and the sheikh would be chosen as the leader of the tribe, generally by a council of elders. The older men within the tribe would choose from among themselves who they thought was the wisest, who would become the leader, and this would be the person who would settle disputes, who would give learned judgments, and basically run the tribe. Okay, so that's the situation at the time. Now, Muhammad grows up, and by the time he's in his teenage years, he becomes a caravan leader. Or first of all, he doesn't start as the leader, but works in caravans, but he later works his way up so that by the time he is 20, he is actually the leader of various caravans. Most of these caravans are going up the coast of the Arabian Peninsula and into the areas that would now be Jordan, Syria, Israel, Palestine, that part of the world. Okay? Now, you can imagine that as he is doing this, he is also coming in contact with other people, with more Jews, with more Christians. And because he is going through the desert with his caravans, he's also coming in contact with what we can see as sort of the forefathers of monasticism, some of the desert fathers who live in the desert, particularly in what is now Jordan. And he speaks of this. We find reference to these people in the Qur'an, where he talks about people who live alone in the desert to worship their God. And so he would have talked to them, he would have known them, and known some of their beliefs and some of their practices. Now, he begins doing caravans for a wealthy widow named Khadija, and Khadija is about 15 years older than he is, and she is impressed both by his honesty, his acumen, and supposedly also by his good looks. They say he was a handsome dude. We don't have any pictures, okay? But she proposes to him. And I find this rather interesting. We think there wasn't any feminism in those days, She was running the show. And she proposes to him, and he accepts. He marries her. By all accounts, it was a love match. She was his only wife as long as she lived. And they seem to have been deeply devoted to each other. Okay, so we get up to 610. Muhammad is 40 years old at this point, living a somewhat more settled life now in Mecca, and but he's bothered by interior concerns, spiritual concerns, basically. Some of them are interior. He's bothered as to his own relationship with God. Some of them are external. He's bothered by what he sees going on around him in Mecca, and particularly in his own tribe. As I mentioned, this is the tribe that's at the top, politically and economically, and he sees them not treating the underclasses, not treating the orphan and the widow particularly well. He's concerned about this because, remember, he was an orphan himself, taken in and raised by his grandfather first and then by one of his uncles. And so he starts basically going on little mini retreats. He goes out to this mountain outside of Mecca. It's now called Jabal al-Nur, or the Mountain of Light. And he just, basically sits and contemplates, gets out of the hustle and bustle of town, and thinks about things, what should be done. And it is while he is on the mountain one time that he suddenly feels a great crushing weight, as if the life was just being squeezed out of him. And he feels this presence that fills the whole sky and everything around him. And he believes it is the presence of an angel, and the angel says to him, recite. And he says, I am not a reciter. And the angel says, recite. Now, what does he mean, I am not a reciter? The Arabian Peninsula at this time, most people are illiterate or semi-literate at best. Okay, so the history, the literature, the poetry is the province of a group of people who are, by trade, formal reciters. Think of Homer with like the Odyssey and the Iliad. It's the same thing, that these people's job was simply to memorize the lore of the community, to memorize its history, its stories, its poems, and to recite them. So, as a caravan person and then a sort of a businessman, Muhammad is not a reciter. He says, I'm not a reciter. But still he is told to recite, and the first surah or chapter of the Qur'an is given to him. Now, this is not the first surah as we find it in the Qur'an now, but just chronologically, the first surah is given to him. Muhammad experiences this, basically runs home, throws himself into Khadija's lap, and says, I'm losing it, or words to that effect. And she calms him down and says, okay, tell me what happened. And he tells her what happened, and it basically says, do you think I'm going out of my mind? And she says, well, let's go talk to my uncle. He's a Christian, and he knows more about this sort of thing than we do. So she takes him to talk to her uncle, who is a Christian, and he says, well, down through history there have been prophets. And these have been men to whom God spoke with a revelation for their community, and this might very well be what's happening here. So see what happens. If it's kind of a one-off thing, don't worry about it too much. But if it continues, it may be that you are called to be a prophet to our community. So when you think about it, the first Muslims, at least the first people who listened to Muhammad and that he was getting revelations, are a woman and a Christian. Now, Muhammad does continue to get these revelations, but he's frightened and he doesn't think they're going to be particularly well received by the community. And so he keeps them pretty much to himself. Finally, after a time, 3 years, in fact, he waits, and then he takes his message public. First, simply within his own tribe. And it does not go particularly well. He tells them, well, I've been receiving messages from God for the past 3 years. And people are like, yeah, sure, And then, well, what did these messages say? Well, they said that there's too much income inequality. Sound familiar? Yeah. And we should be redistributing and taking better care of the poor and the orphans and the widows and stuff. And you remember, this is the Quraysh he's talking to. They're like, yeah, sure. Okay. Finally, in fact, in gathering of his small sub-tribe, he says, will no one believe me? And finally, a 10-year-old child steps forward and said, well, I believe you, Uncle Muhammad, but it doesn't go too well. And it takes a fairly long time for him to gain followers in Mecca. He does slowly gain followers over, again, years, several years. And there's a small community that starts to form around him saying, I think you're right. God probably is saying that we're not living the way we should be living. And the Meccans don't like this. The Quraysh don't like this. Okay, why don't they like this? Well, it's going to hit them in the pocketbook, right? Because first of all, he's proclaiming there is only one God. And they're thinking, well, this is going to be a problem. Then we're not going to have everybody coming on pilgrimage to the Kaaba. Secondly, he's saying, you got to redistribute the wealth. Well, nobody ever likes to hear that. Okay, so this doesn't go particularly well. In fact, the Meccans decide that to keep more people from joining this now fledgling group, they're going to organize a boycott. And they do. So they organize a commercial boycott against the Muslims that they can't buy and sell in the marketplace. And this gets to be very hard for them. It's a time of real hardship, of hunger for the group because they're being boycotted in the marketplace. And the biggest blow comes to Muhammad in 619 when both his wife Khadijah and his uncle who had raised him, Abu Talib, die. And his uncle had been his protector. His uncle had a higher status among the Quraysh and was, pretty much, keeping him from being run out of town, basically. And so when his uncle dies and his wife dies, Muhammad is really kind of left on his own. So, a couple years again, it's 3 years later, a town, an oasis town to the northeast of Mecca, has heard about Muhammad, and this town has several different members of several different tribes living there, and they are having a dispute with each other. There are also several Jewish tribes living there, and they decide that maybe Muhammad would be a good sort of conciliator. Maybe he could come and reconcile some of their differences, be a mediator between the troops. So they invite him to come. The town's name is Yathrib. It's now called Medina, and you can see it there on the map. Medina simply means the city, and it's short for the city of the Prophet, which was the later name given to the town. Muhammad decides it might be a good idea to go to Yathrib rather than staying in Mecca, because things aren't going particularly well in Mecca. And his followers leave Mecca clandestinely in, 2s and 3s and 4s and head up to Yathrib. And finally, Muhammad goes with them. And the story goes that the night he left, his cousin Ali says, look, I'll sleep in your bed. If anybody is watching, to see, they'll think you're there. This will give you time to get a good head start and head on up to Yathrib. They're not going to do anything to me. And so this is what happens. And finally, the whole community, Muslim community, moves up to Yathrib. It turns out that Muhammad is a pretty good mediator. They settle their disputes, and in a sense, they elect Muhammad to be the sheikh of the town. Okay? And so Muhammad now is both a political leader in Medina and a religious leader. Doesn't mean everybody in Medina buys his version of religion, but he does become the religious leader of what now becomes a growing group. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about that. So the community in Medina, it's a new tribe because now it's not a tribe that's based on bloodlines anymore. Anybody who wants can come here. And in fact, Muhammad declares Medina a sanctuary city, which means that anyone who, is a little bit in trouble with the law or a runaway slave or something like that can come to Medina and get sanctuary. So his following really begins to grow. He guides the community in two ways. One way is by the revelations that keep coming, which become the Qur'an, and the other is simply through his own legal judgments and his own, basically his example of how he lives. And these become collected later on and become a body that is called the Hadith, which are the sayings and the example of Muhammad. We'll talk a little more about the Hadith later. Okay, but let's just look at what's in a few of these sayings. So one of the things that I've already mentioned is that Muhammad stresses care for the less fortunate. So here among the Hadith are two things that we find. I and the person who looks after an orphan and provides for him will be like this in paradise, this close. Another one, Islam began as a stranger and it will return to being a stranger. So blessed are the strangers. So care for others, including the strangers. What about women? Okay, so both in the Quran and the Hadith, we tend to think of Islam as being extremely restrictive to women. But in fact, in Medina under Muhammad, it was exactly the opposite. It was terribly forward-looking. Here's just a list. Women get equality of reward for their deeds. The Quran is clear everywhere that men and women are spiritually equal. But let's go on. Women have the right and duty to obtain an education, the right to obtain provisions from her father or brothers until she gets married, the right to have her own independent property. I see the influence of Khadija here, right? She was the wealthy widow. She maintained ownership of the property. The right to provisions from her husband, the right to work to earn money if they needed or wanted, the right to keep her own money, the right to express their opinion and be heard, the right to negotiate marriage terms of her choice. Women at this time had the right to have a prenup, okay? The right to obtain divorce from her husband, unheard of in the 600s, okay? And the right to have custody of their children after divorce. Now, you're probably looking at this and thinking, boy, everything I've heard of Saudi Arabia, this doesn't sound like what I've heard at all. It doesn't. It isn't. We're going to find out why later. But among the Hadith and among the injunctions about women, inheritance, property ownership within the Quran, all of this is there. Okay, there's also a lot of practicality. I don't know if you can read the one, but one of my favorite stories is that a man came to Muhammad and he said, well, since God is omnipotent and in charge of everything, and we're supposed to trust him, do I need to tie up my camel? And Muhammad said, trust in Allah, but tie up your camel first. Okay? Another one that I love is, the strong man is not the one who is good at wrestling, but the strong man is the one who controls himself in a fit of rage. Okay? So you get a little bit of a sense for this man and for what he was trying to teach people. Now let's look at the sacred revelations. Now, the understanding Muhammad had, and Muslims have to this day, is that these revelations were the word of God dictated to Muhammad through the archangel Gabriel. That it was Gabriel's voice that he was hearing that said recite, and that gave him these things. And he said, whenever these things would happen, he would suddenly, feel this great weight. He would tremble or shake. These words would come to him that he would say, I couldn't have dreamt this up, okay? And that this was why he believed he was hearing the word of God. This is the first surah of the Qur'an. In the name of God, the most compassionate, most merciful. All praise belongs to God, Lord of all worlds, most compassionate, most merciful, ruler of the day of judgment. It is you we worship and your aid we seek. Show us the straight path, the way of those you have graced, not of those deserving anger, nor of those who wander lost. This surah is prayed 5 times a day by all Muslims. It is part of every prayer. And in many ways, it has much of Islam in a nutshell inside of it. The first words, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in Arabic, are the most common words in the Qur'an. They begin every single chapter. Every surah begins with these words. But every surah does not just begin with these words. They appear again and again and again, as we see even in this very short first surah. Go down 3 lines, and you've got most compassionate, most merciful. Repeat it. And you find it again in the Qur'an, often in somewhat unlikely places. For example, next line, ruler of the day of judgment. There is quite a bit of language in the Qur'an about the day of judgment. Some of it is rather fearful, although much of it is not particularly fearful. For example, for us, it says, be they Muslim, Christian, Jew, or Sabaean, those who believe in God and follow his way have nothing to fear on the last day. Okay, all of us monotheists are in good shape. But there are a lot of things, particularly railing against those who take advantage of the poor, the orphan, the widow, and what's going to happen to them if they don't mend their ways. Interestingly enough, though, even after there's some fire and brimstone, the Quran will almost always turn around and say, but only Allah knows, and Allah is the most compassionate and the most merciful. So it always comes back to these words, that God is the most compassionate, most merciful. And by the way, since I just sort of interchangeably used Allah and God, let me just say that's because Allah is simply Arabic for the God. The al part is simply the definite article in Arabic. Think about all the words in English that begin with al. Jack, I'm sure you could give me one. Algebra, begin with al. Algebra, yeah, algebra, algorithm, alchemy. Alchemy just means the chemistry. Okay, these all came into our language through Islam and from the Middle East. So then we got the last part, la. It's basically an L with a vowel after it. Where do we find, well, let me just say something about Semitic languages. Semitic languages are built on consonant roots. It can go like from 1 usually up to 3 is probably the most common number of consonants. And then you get different words by putting different vowels in around these consonants. Okay, for an example, think about SLM, Islam. Okay, then you get Muslim. It's also got the SLM in it. Okay, what Hebrew word do you know that has SLM as its roots? Shalom, right? Which is the same as salam, which is the Arabic version of shalom. So we find these word families. Now, they often say, well, Islam means submission, and people have thought, ooh, that's kind of harsh. Okay, but it's SLM, which also, slightly different vowels, means peace. And it's going to carry the overtones of its whole word family. And so it's not submission like in, slavery, or you've just got to submit, darn it. It's submission as in, if you follow the will of God, you will find the way of peace. Okay? So if we go back to the word for God, Allah, where in the scripture do you find something based on El, meaning God? Elohim, okay. El Shaddai. So we find, again, that El is the common word throughout the Semitic countries at this time, simply designating God, or the gods in Elohim, that's the plural. So Allah is not the name of a different God. Allah is simply Arabic for the word God. Okay. One other thing I'll mention here, show us the straight path. The straight path is Sharia. It's the way. It can be seen as sort of the way to the oasis, the straight path. And we will come back to talk about Sharia a little bit later. Okay, what else is in the Qur'an? Well, we can't look at all of it in that kind of detail, but let me just give you an overview. The Qur'an itself, they did not remember exactly, when the different revelations came to Muhammad. The Qur'an was put together after Muhammad's death, and so they simply said, oh, well, let's just arrange it in order of length. So they put the longest ones first, maybe thinking, okay, well, people will start at the beginning. I don't know if any of you are like me, but I don't know how many times I've read Genesis, because when I was a kid, like every year I'd make a New Year's resolution, I'm going to read the Bible, and I'd start at Genesis, and I'd get through Genesis, and probably through Exodus, and then I'd get into Leviticus, and it's all ended there, Or maybe I'd get to Numbers, and it all ended there. Okay, so then I'd say, all right, I'm going to start with the New Testament. I've read Mark, I don't know how many times, Matthew and Mark, but not get too much further. So they put the long ones first, thinking, all right, people will get through the long ones at least. So anyway, scholars since then, though, have said, we think we can figure out which ones came from Mecca and which ones came from Medina. So the Meccan surahs have a lot of familiar Bible stories. So we find Adam and Eve in the garden, Noah and the flood. We find Abraham and all of his children, Isaac and Ishmael. Now, often the stories are told slightly differently. For example, the story of Abraham sacrificing his son in the Qur'an has him almost sacrificing Ishmael rather than Isaac. Okay? We find the story about Hagar and Ishmael being sent out into the desert, but now, they become sort of the protagonists of the story, because Ishmael is regarded as the father of the Arabic tribes. So we find Joseph in his coat of many colors. We find Moses taking the Israelites out of Egypt. We find the Annunciation and the birth of Jesus. We find stories of Jesus working miracles, healing the sick, all that kind of thing. We find stories about Jesus that aren't in the Bible. One of them is when Jesus is a little boy. He makes a bunch of clay birds and then breathes on them and they fly away. Kind of a pretty little story. But so we find some of the same stories that are in the Bible, some of them with a little twist, some of them pretty much the same. We find other stories about biblical characters, but not ones that are in the Bible. We find some beautiful poetry about God, stuff much like you find in the Psalms, about God's greatness and glory and the beauty of the earth and that kind of thing. We find a lot of social justice and a lot about the Day of Judgment, and these two are often linked with saying, if you don't start being nicer, look out. The Day of Judgment is at hand, and things won't go happy for you then. In the Medinan surahs, we suddenly find a lot of practical matters. almost as if, God knew that Muhammad was having some trouble leading this large and diverse community and needed some guidance. So we find very specific rules on how inheritance ought to be divided. And by the way, among those rules is that daughters get a share as well. It doesn't just go to the sons. They don't get as much as the sons get, but they get something. Food and drink, marriage and divorce, some things that are just plain etiquette rules for how people should live. Hygiene rules, for example. And then rules for the religious practices. And what is laid down then are the 5 basic religious practices of Islam, which are to basically say the Shahada, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is God's prophet, to pray 5 times a day, to fast for the month of Ramadan, to make a pilgrimage to Mecca in your life if you can, and to give of your wealth to the poor. So those are all laid out. So this part of the Qur'an forms the basis of Sharia law. At least it does some of the time. Okay? And much of it is simply extremely practical. For example, when it talks about fasting during Ramadan, it says you should fast from sunup to sundown. Well, how do you know when it's sunup or sundown? Well, in the community, you'll hear the calls to prayer. That'll take care of it. But what if I'm, out in the desert? Well, then when you can tell the difference between a white thread and a black thread, then it's dawn. When you can't tell anymore, okay, it's night, you can eat. Okay? Also, in the practicality are things like it says, well, everyone should fast from sunup to sundown, but not the kids. Don't force this on your children. Not pregnant or nursing women. We don't want to risk your health. Not anyone who's sick. If you're sick, go ahead and eat. Not the elderly. The elderly will get a dispensation as well. Not those who have work they cannot get out of that is heavy manual labor. Because fasting, remember, is not just don't eat, you don't drink as well. Not those on a journey for the same reason. If you're traveling and you're out in the desert, you need to drink water. And so it's all very practical. It says, well, if you can't fast during Ramadan, maybe you can fast some other time. So you can put off your fast and do it later. Or, well, even if you can't do that, because suppose you have a medical condition, you're diabetic or something, you can't fast, then instead give money to the poor. If you can't do that, then pray for the poor. If you can't do that, then at least think good thoughts and abstain from thinking, fast from evil thoughts. That at least you should be able to do. So it's very practical. Much of it is practical. In fact, another piece of practicality, you may have thought, well, how come in the mosque the women are in the back? Again, is this some sort of discrimination against women? Actually, it's pure practicality. Okay? First of all, who's more likely to have the little children? Okay, they're probably going to be with the women. Therefore, kind of nice to have them in the back. They start crying, you can take them out. But there's actually even a bigger reason than that. When Muslims pray, they prostrate themselves on the floor. Okay, if you bend all the way down to the floor, the head goes down, what goes up? Okay? Practicality. We just don't want the guys to be too distracted. All right? Okay, so we're talking about women. Let's talk about women's dress. What is in the Qur'an about women's dress? Actually, very little. Okay? There are 2 major verses. This is one of them. And say to the believing women that they lower their gaze and restrain their sexual passions, and do not display their ornaments except what appears thereof, and let them draw a veil over their bosoms and they should not display their ornaments. And let them not strike their feet so that the ornaments that they hide may be known. What do you think is a woman's ornament? Well, you know, this takes a little exegesis. And some men have said, oh, everything about a woman is so precious, you got to cover the whole thing. And some women have said, oh, that's nice. You know, he thinks all of me is so precious. But I doubt that that's the original intent. Okay, here you think, okay, what's the intent here? And there are actually two possibilities. Okay, I know you guys are all thinking about one of them. But so here are two pictures. Okay, one picture of, these are from National Geographic, so, you know, they're okay. But one of them says, okay, so here's a tribal woman from pretty much this part. Let's look at the one on the left. In the Bedouin tribes who are moving around the peninsula with their herds, what is the easiest way to make your wealth mobile? Jewelry. Turn it into gold and hang it on your wives, right? And so if we go back, to let them draw a veil over their bosoms, they should not display their ornaments, and let them not strike their feet, so the ornaments they hide may be known. We may simply be talking about, ladies, no ostentatious display of your wealth here when you go out. Cover your jewelry, and don't strike your feet so that it jangles, and people know, oh, wow, she's got a lot of gold on. Okay? Or there's the other option as well, that in a hot climate, some dress might have been a bit scanty around the house. And so if we go back to let them draw a veil over their bosoms and not display their ornaments, well, we may be simply saying, when you go out of the house, ladies, cover your chest. Okay? Dress is also a statement of class and occupation. And among the Quraysh at this time, the highest class women were the most veiled. Why? Well, you know, because it was a sign that they didn't have to work, that they didn't have to be out in the marketplace, or they didn't have to be out with the flocks. And so you could also see veiling as having its origins in a class structure. Another part of the Qur'an that people have used to say, well, women should be veiled is, and when you speak to the prophet's wives, do so from behind a curtain. Now, the question here is, okay, where is this curtain hanging? You could hang it on the woman, and that is often how this is interpreted. When you speak to women who are somebody else's wives, you should do so, you know, they should be covered or veiled. But it's also highly likely because Muhammad's house was also the mosque. And because Muhammad was the sheikh and people were coming to him for guidance, for solving of disputes, that people would have been in and out of the courtyard of his house all the time. Now, we're in a desert, right? There's not that much wood, so how are doors likely to be covered? By a curtain, okay? So this could simply be a bit of etiquette or even a little bit of frustration on Muhammad's part, saying, stop barging into my house, you know? If you want something from my wives, talk to them from behind the curtain. Okay. What we get is that somehow women's dress becomes important no matter which way you look at it. I love this cartoon. One of my students gave it to me, where, for those of you who might not be able to see, back in the corner, the woman in the bikini is saying, and the dark glasses is saying of the woman who is in hijab, everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. The woman in hijab is saying, nothing covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. Oh. And sadly, we run into precisely this issue. So that you find the picture on the left, this came from the news this summer, That's a woman wearing a burkini on the beach in France, and the police are standing over her and actually making her disrobe, okay, on the beach. At the same time, the other photo is taken in Iran, and these women are being arrested by the police because their bangs are showing. They've got too much hair showing. And I know this happens. When I was in Iran, I actually ran into trouble one time when I was out. Bangs are totally the wrong hairstyle if you're going to wear hijab. But unfortunately, that's the hairstyle I had. Of course, they keep slipping out. You could try to pin them back, but they pull out and fall down. And I'm walking past a mosque, and this guy ran up to me and started beating me. Well, with a feather duster, okay? It hit me around the shoulders with this feather duster, and of course this long thing in Farsi, which I don't understand a word of, so I'm like looking at him like, Finally I get it. It's like, oh, I'm walking past a mosque and my hair is showing. And that's the problem that's happening. So for women, it becomes I'd say it's more politicized, really, than part of the religion. And I say that because we are still talking about, well, what about Muhammad? Here's another hadith. Umar, who is one of the Prophet's friends and companions, used to say to the Prophet, "Let your wives be veiled." But Allah's messenger did not do so. Well, it's there in the hadith that his wives were not veiled. Okay. Umar, by the way, was a military man, not married at all, and kind of famous for his misogyny. And he becomes the second caliph after Muhammad. And it's actually under Umar's time that a lot of those things that I showed you about women start to disappear. Okay? Okay, let's say a few things about slaves, since we hear about that with regard to ISIS. ISIS enslaving women. What does the Qur'an say about that? Well, here it's a little more mixed. It does say, "Who abstain from sex except with those joined to them in the marriage bond or the captives whom their right hand possesses." It also says, "But now enjoy what you took in war, lawful and good." And also says, "Marry those among you who are single and those who are fit among your male slaves and your female slaves." It's a little bit of a mixed message. It does say, you can have sex with your captives or your slaves. This is not uncommon. At the time, it was the common practice. But it also says, but if they're fit, why don't you marry them instead? Or marry them to each other. And then it says an awful lot about freeing the slave. So, it is not righteousness that you turn your faces toward east or west, but it is righteousness to spend of your substance for the ransom of slaves. And never should a believer kill a believer, but if it so happens by mistake, compensation is due. If one so kills a believer, it is ordained that he should free a slave and pay compensation to the deceased family. And verily, we have created man into toil and struggle, and what will explain to you the path that is steep? Freeing the slave. So freeing the slave is seen as one of the most righteous works that you can do within Islam. So, kind of a mixed message. We find a bit of a mixed message in the Bible as well, because even there we find, slaves obey your master. Slavery was common at the time. Okay, now it's time for the test, time for the quiz. So here you are. I've got 7 things up here. I'm going to read them for those of you who probably can't see them or who are around the corner. And I'd like you just to think whether you think this comes from the Bible or the Qur'an. Show forgiveness, speak for justice, and avoid the ignorant. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Fight in the way of God those who fight against you, but do not transgress. God does not love the transgressor. Utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling. Happy shall he be that take and dash their little ones against the rock. And when the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. And the servants of the Most Merciful are those who walk upon the earth easily, and when the ignorant address them harshly, they say words of peace. Some are some you probably know from the Bible, Others, kind of hard to tell, isn't it? Okay. Well, here are the answers, all right? The green ones, green for Islam, are from the Qur'an. The red ones are from the Bible. So the top two I put together because they strike me as so similar. Show forgiveness, speak for justice, and avoid the ignorant comes from the Qur'an. Show justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God comes from the Bible. Fight in the way of God those who fight against you but do not transgress. God does not love the transgressor comes from the Qur'an. So does number 6. And when the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. However, in the Bible we find, utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not. Slay both man, woman, infant, and suckling. And happy shall he be that take and dash their little ones against the rock. So, when people say, well, but Islam, it's a warlike religion, look at this verse, when the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. Well, okay, so let's talk about Judaism and Christianity and dashing their babies' heads on the rock, shall we? I mean, you can find in sacred texts pretty much anything you want if you take things out of context and out of their historical context. And finally, at the end, we have one from the Qur'an that kind of goes back to the beginning. The servants of the Most Merciful are those who walk easily upon the earth, and when the ignorant address them harshly, they say words of peace. So there's good things, there's some bad things, but just like we have in our own scripture. In fact, one thing I could just mention here, we often think of a part of Sharia law being that women who commit adultery should be stoned. That is not in the Qur'an. The Qur'an says the Qur'an says if people commit adultery, both the man and the women should be whipped. Okay? Stoning is in Deuteronomy. It's in the Bible. Okay? It's also a custom that predates Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. So we find things that we think are in the Qur'an that actually aren't. And by the way, while I'm on the stoning business or the adultery business, it also says in the Qur'an, but you don't mete out this punishment unless there are 4 witnesses to the act. Well, how often do you think folks are going to get whipped, right? They're doing it in front of the mosque, maybe. But you need 4 witnesses. Okay, more if the witnesses are women, because you need two female witnesses for every male witness, so you would need 8 women to witness the act. Okay, there are problems that we share with Islam, that all people of the book share. And the first is, what do we do when the book no longer matches the culture? Okay, this is a problem that we face as well. The Bible, the stories in the Bible, think about the parables in the New Testament. These are written for an agrarian culture. And we primarily aren't anymore. I think about, there's so much about, the sheep and the shepherd, about the weeds and the tares, the grain and the tares, the mustard seed, that, I look at little kids now that are all plugged into their machines, and I think, wow, what, have they, do they know anything about sheep and shepherds and farming? Not much, okay? And so what happens? Well, we have to explain. And so we explain about what is being said in these parables. And after a while, our kids say, oh, okay, I get it. Okay? But saying, oh, I get it, is different than when the story is told in the idiom of your own culture. These stories are meant to whap you upside the head and make you see the world in a completely different way. And it's pretty hard to do when you have to explain it. It's like explaining a joke, right? You know, you tell a joke and you want people to go, "Wah!" You know, and well, if you tell a joke and they're going, "I don't get it," and you go, "Oh, well, it's because this, and that." "Oh, I get it." You know, it's not very funny, right? Same thing. So much in our religious traditions is meant to have that aha factor. And we lose the aha factor when it's based in a different culture, and we have to change it. So what do? You could say, well, we're going to rewrite the scriptures in a different idiom. That isn't always particularly successful. I remember as a kid there was the Cotton Patch Gospels going around, which tried to rewrite it in like a southern idiom, and that didn't last very long. You can say, well, then the culture had just better go back to being the culture that matches the sacred text. This is what groups like the Taliban and ISIS are trying to do. Take the culture back so it matches your text. Okay? Well, how well is that going to work? Probably not very well. Okay? Or you end up saying, well, we'll just have to explain the text, do the best we can to keep the message. Can we pick and choose verses? Well, we've already talked about that one. Okay, if we take things out of context, you can get just about anything out of your sacred scriptures. So do we look at the spirit of the law or the letter of the law? One of the things I'm going to say is that we all pick and choose. And even the most dedicated fundamentalist literalists pick and choose. I think the best example of this was something Bill Cahoy, the former dean of the School of Theology, once said, when he said, you know, I'm going to take biblical literalists a lot more seriously when I see a lot more one-eyed or one-handed biblical literalists walking around. Because of the verse where Jesus says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, chop it off. Anybody taking that literally? Don't think so. Okay. So we do already choose and go for the Spirit. It's just a question of how far or how not so far do we go with this. Now we come up on some of the fun stuff. We're going to talk about jihad and what's actually in the Qur'an, what actually happened in the wars, and then we're going to talk about Sharia law, and then finish up with a few ideas and then have lots of time for questions. Okay, so obviously when we think about ISIS, we think about jihad. They seem to be dedicated to the task of so-called holy warfare. The first thing I want to say is that the word jihad simply means struggle. So it does not mean holy war, or it doesn't even mean war. It simply means struggle. And from 625 to 628, the community in Medina enters into a period of warfare. And it's a defensive warfare for the Muslims. The Meccans kind of, 622, remember, is when the Hijrah happens, when the community moves to Yathrib. So 625 is only 3 years later. The community has grown in Yathrib. Now remember that I said it's a sanctuary city. Okay. Couple other things to think about. Muhammad is still preaching that there's only one God. Okay. He is also still talking about social justice and redistribution and all of that. As the community, at first, when the Muslims leave Mecca, the Meccans just say, okay, good riddance, we're glad they're gone. But as the community continues to grow in Medina, they say, whoa, okay, they're gone but not forgotten. They're still having an influence on us. So they don't like the monotheism being preached. They don't like the sanctuary city idea. They don't like the idea that there can be a tribe that isn't based on bloodlines anymore, because this overturns the whole social system. And then there was that little matter about the caravan raiding. Caravan raiding at the time was kind of an equal opportunity sport. Everybody engaged in it. However, when we go back, in fact, let's go all the way back to a map here. I should have stuck a map in there. We'll find, oops, there it went. Okay, look at the locations of Mecca and Medina. Okay, so we got Mecca down here and we got Medina up here. If you're running caravans up into this sort of greater Middle East area, you can see the problem. The Meccan caravans have to go right past Medina to get there and back. Whereas the Medina caravans don't have that problem. They can avoid Mecca completely, just go north from there. The only problem they might have is if they're going down to Yemen, they have to go past Mecca. But most of the trade is going in the other direction. So the Medinans are getting the better of the Meccans in the sport of caravan raiding, and the Meccans are not happy. Ever notice that it's always when it hits the pocketbook that people get really upset? So they attack Medina. And for 3 years, there's a series of battles or wars, where basically the two groups fight until, either the weather gets too bad and they can't do it, or they're just exhausted, and they pull apart for a brief period, and then they go at it again after a while. In one of these times when there was a lull in the fighting, and at first the wars went quite badly for the Muslims. One of them, they barely, got anybody home from it. And they limped back into Medina, and the guys who were still alive are going, phew, oh, thank goodness, the jihad is over. And Muhammad is said to have laughed, and he said, that was the little jihad. Now you have the greater jihad. And they said, well, what could be worse than that? What could be greater than that? And he said, the lesser jihad, is fighting in defense. The greater jihad is fighting your own temptations. So, and jihad is used in Islam also for that struggle that we all have internally, with the dark side of our... Well, that's real helpful. The struggle we all have with the dark side. Okay. Finally, the Medinans are victorious, and the Meccans go back in defeat. And they are chased, by the Medinans pretty much all the way to the city walls of Mecca. But Muhammad does not enter the city with his troops. Okay, they're outside of Mecca, and he says, look, we're going to ask for permission. So they ask for permission to enter the city, and the Meccans say, of course not. And the troops are saying, well, we're just going anyway. And Muhammad kills a goat. And the killing of a goat is the ritual ending of the pilgrimage to Mecca. And so it's symbolized for the Medinans, no, any trip to Mecca is over. We just killed the goat. And reluctantly, they withdraw. And Muhammad waits 2 years before going back. And after 2 years, goes back and asks permission to enter the city, and permission is granted. Okay, at this point, the Muslims enter Mecca. They go to the Kaaba. They make their pilgrimage to the Kaaba, but since they are now making a pilgrimage under the belief that there is only one God, they empty the Kaaba of all of its statues. And so the Kaaba is emptied and cleansed of the 360 different statues. Interestingly enough, however, one thing remains. On one of the interior walls of the Kaaba, there was a fresco of Mary and Jesus. And they do not destroy the fresco, they whitewash over it and leave it there. And this shows the esteem that Mary and Jesus are held in Islam. After the Prophet Muhammad, Jesus is thought to be the most influential prophet. And then Moses comes third. And Mary, his mother, is also revered as a saint and a very holy woman. And one of the things that they also believe is that Jesus will return. There will be a second coming. Now, again, there's always a little twist. Okay, the twist in the Muslim belief is that they believe Jesus would have been the final prophet, but his mission, his teaching was cut short by his crucifixion. That's why they believe there was one more prophet, but that Jesus would have been it. However, they believe that at the crucifixion, Jesus was not actually dead when he was taken down from the cross. And that explains, his resurrection from the tomb. However, they believe in the assumption into heaven, in his ascension. Okay? So they believe that just as in the Old Testament it said that Elijah was carried up into heaven, that Jesus was carried up into heaven as well. And that in the end times, both Elijah and Jesus will return to earth. Okay? And ISIS even believes in a final battle. They have it not taking place at Armageddon, but taking place outside of a Syrian village called Dabiq. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But Jesus will come again. Okay. Muhammad gives amnesty to almost all of the fighters of the Meccans. Okay, now, there's one story you may have heard, however, is that during one of these wars, he kills the Jews. And this does happen. There are several Jewish tribes, I mentioned, living in Yathrib, now Medina. They remained there, and at the beginning of the Meccan Wars, the Jews fought alongside the Muslims, defending their city. However, as I mentioned, things didn't go well for them in the first battle, and one of the Jewish tribes then decided that, hey, looks like the Meccans are going to win, and they clandestinely negotiated with the Meccans that if the Meccans would attack again, they would let them into the city. And it was that Jewish tribe that Muhammad ordered be killed. And it was for treachery in the wars. Okay, so that tells you a little bit about the history of jihad. Now let's take a look at the Qur'an. The Qur'an is not pacifistic. It does give permission to fight. So here are two verses. Remember, thy Lord inspired the angels with the message, I am with you. Give firmness to the believers. I will instill terror into the hearts of the unbelievers, smite you above their necks, and smite all their fingertips off them. Okay, not so nice, but it's in the context of ongoing warfare. And then we saw part of the other one. When the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them captive and besiege them, and prepare for them each ambush. But if they repent and establish worship and pay the poor tax, then leave their way free. Lo, Allah is the most compassionate, the most merciful. Okay, so if you take this one out of its larger context, it sounds pretty awful. When the sacred months have passed, take them captive, besiege them, prepare for them ambush. But if you go on, it's saying, but, if they mend their ways, repent, pay the poor tax, leave them free. Okay, here we go. This one is about making allies. It says, Allah does not forbid you from those who do not fight you because of religion, and do not expel you from your homes, from being righteous toward them and acting justly toward them. Indeed, Allah loves those who act justly. Allah only forbids you from those who fight you because of religion and expel you from your homes, and aid in your expulsion. Forbids that you make allies of them, and whoever makes allies of them, then it is those who are the wrongdoers. Okay, here you see two things. These are the reasons for warfare. Someone who fights you because of religion or expels you from your homes. And you will often hear justification given by ISIS, given by Al-Qaeda, different groups of terrorists, that they might say, we are fighting on behalf of the Palestinians who have been expelled from their home. And that is lawful in the Qur'an. Also, permission is given to fight those who fight you, but particularly on the grounds of religion. Therefore, when we say there's a fight between Islam and the West, we're playing right into their hands. We're playing into their hands of saying, oh, it's about our religion. Well, then permission is given to fight. So, be better not to do that. When to fight? Okay, there's just warfare in the Qur'an, and it has two pieces, when to fight and how to fight. It very much parallels the Augustinian just warfare that we see laid out by St. Augustine. Again, the same thing, when to fight, how to fight. So, when to fight? We've already seen a bit of that, but here is more. To those against whom war is made, permission is given to fight because they are wronged. And verily Allah is most powerful for their aid. Those who have been expelled from their homes for no cause except that they say, our Lord is Allah. You know, you can see the history coming through this, right? You know, the fact that they felt they had to leave Mecca, expelled from their homes because they were believing only in one God. Okay, the other one we've seen already in the middle, down at the bottom. If any one of the idolaters seek thy protection, protect him till he hears the word of Allah, then convey him to his place of safety. This is because they are a people who know not. And finally, we often hear, yes, but wasn't Islam spread by the sword? However, it says in the Qur'an, there is no compulsion in religion. It goes on further. There are other verses that I didn't put up here. But one of them says, you know, I could have made you all believe in the same religion, but I did not. Therefore, vie with one another to do good works. Okay? So there is not a single verse in the Qur'an that says to spread religion by the sword. There's another verse where Muhammad says, you know, to you your faith, to me mine. So, no compulsion in religion. Now, how to fight? Fight in the cause of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress limits, for Allah loves not transgressors. We saw that one already. So there are limits. That one is in the Qur'an. The limits are only vaguely spelled out in the Qur'an, but in the Hadith they are spelled out more. And we find one of these down below. These were instructions given by Abu Bakr, who is the first caliph after Muhammad. And he says, do not betray, be treacherous or vindictive. Do not mutilate. Do not kill children, the aged, or women. Do not cut or burn palm trees or fruit trees. Do not slay a sheep, a cow, or camel except for your food. And you will come across people who stay in hermitages for worship. Leave them alone to what they devote themselves to. There are other places where it says, any temples, churches, monasteries, that these places should be left alone. But you can see, no scorched earth policies here. Trees, fruit trees in particular, are pretty rare in the desert. Don't cut them down. No poisoning of wells or salting the earth is found in other places. Don't kill non-combatants. Don't kill out of revenge or be vindictive. Many of these same things as we find in the Augustinian just war theory. Okay. And finally, if anyone slew a person, unless it be for murder or spreading mischief in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole people. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of the whole people. And this verse of the Qur'an has been taken as the motto of the White Helmets. You know that group? They're the kind of the first responders in Syria who will rush into an area that's been bombed or attacked, and try to save people, which is a very risky thing to do because Assad's troops were often doing a sort of double attack where they would attack first, wait for the respondents to come, and then attack again. But their motto was this, that if you saved one life, it was as if you saved the whole people. Okay, now let's talk about Sharia law. Especially around election time, we hear people saying, well, we never want any Sharia law here in America. The Muslims are going to want to enact Sharia law. And my first reaction to that is sort of to scratch my head and say, which Sharia law? Because there is no one Sharia law. There are many different versions of law. Okay, and historically, Sharia law comes about after Muhammad's death. In 632, Muhammad dies. He does not leave any clear successor. He did not have a son to survive infancy. He did have a daughter who survived, but no sons. Had he had a son, probably a son of his would have followed. And so when Muhammad dies, the people are left with the quandary, what now? Who will lead the community? And there are two factions within the community. One faction says, well, now we're going to go back to doing what we have always done. We are a new tribe. We will choose a sheikh according to tribal custom. So we will get together the wisest, oldest men, and we will let them choose among themselves who they think is the wisest person to lead us. They said that person will become our political leader, and we will have to find other people among us who really listened to Muhammad when he told the revelations of God, and who remembers them, and who can become our reciters and recite the Qur'an for us. Okay? There is another group, however, that says, no, they think that the power should remain within Muhammad's family. He doesn't have a son, but he does have a daughter. And the daughter is married to Muhammad's cousin, Ali, who is also have very high standing in the community. And they say, if we let Ali be the follower and the next sheikh, then his sons, can begin a line. They also did not want to separate church and state. They did not want to separate political rule from religious rule, but said, this has been working well for us. They basically had a theocracy in Medina. Let's keep it that way and keep those two types of authority together. And this is where we find the split between the Sunni and the Shiites. Okay, the Shiites Shiite is just a shortening of a much longer phrase of the partisans of Ali. And the Sunni are following the Sunnah, or again, the broad path, and they're just going back to the way things were done. Now, Ali is not a stupid man. He sees this split, and he defers. He says, no, I don't want the leadership. I think it should go to Muhammad's longest and closest friend, Abu Bakr. I step aside. And so at this point, Abu Bakr becomes the next caliph. And we have then a series of 4 caliphs. And in some ways, some Muslims at least, look back on this age of the 4, what they call the 4 rightly guided caliphs, and they say this was a golden age of Islam. Now, what made it golden? Well, probably 2 things. Islam spreads very rapidly at this point. Pretty much Mecca goes all Muslim. They start spreading up the different trade routes and into other areas. You'll notice our friend Umar, the military man who we didn't like women that we already ran into, becomes the second caliph. And it's actually under Umar that a lot of the spread happens. He's followed by a man called Uthman, and then finally Ali takes his turn. The community is united during this time. Probably because Ali was wise enough to wait, take his turn later. Also, the Qur'an and the Hadith are codified during this time. It happens under Umar. Abu Bakr is a very old man. He does not remain caliph for very long. And then Umar takes over. He realizes people are forgetting the parts of the Qur'an. He assembles the people who know it the best, the scholars of the time, has them decide among conflicting versions of their remembrance, writes it down, and then makes sure, or tries to make sure, that all other variant versions, if they were written down, are destroyed, so that there is a single text. Now, it turns out they've actually found some variant versions in places in Yemen. This has happened only quite recently. And there's some dispute as to how early or how late these variant versions might be. So those are some of the reasons why this is called the Golden Age. On the other hand, it ain't so golden, because after Abu Bakr, the next three caliphs are all assassinated. Ooh, okay. One by a Persian slave, who just sees a chance. But others by factions and disputes within the community. And Ali himself is assassinated. And after Ali, again the question rises, okay, now who? Should it be Ali's son or grandsons at this point? Or should we go back into the tribal mode again, pick a new sheikh, could be anybody, whoever we think might have the wisdom. And this is where the real split then occurs between the Sunnis and the Shiites. They appoint someone else to be the sheikh. He turns out not to have been a very good choice. He's someone who basically likes, the pomp and the power of the caliphate more than actually doing the work that needs to be done. And the partisans of Ali then split off and say, his name is Muawiyah. They didn't like Muawiyah, and they split off at this time. Okay, now we also see the beginning of the development of different schools of law. So let's talk about that. There are 4 major schools of law, and we're only going to talk about the Sunnis at this point, because we just don't have time to cover everything. So we're going to let the Shiites go. They kind of travel north and east and settle in the area that's now Iran and Iraq, and a bit in a crescent around towards where Lebanon is now. But we're going to stay on the Arabian Peninsula, and they follow Muawiyah and the Sunnis. Okay, you'll see that the first school of law is called the Hanafi school, follows a person called Abu Hanaf, who died in 767. So we're looking at a little over 100 years after the death of Muhammad. And the Hanafi school basically says, you follow the Qur'an if there's something in the Qur'an. But if there isn't, you use analogy or reason to figure out what there should be. And you do this even above any untrustworthy hadith. Now, when the hadith are recorded, every hadith was recorded with its line of transmission. So there might be a saying like Muhammad said, trust in God, but tie up your camel first. And along with that would be, Muhammad said this to so-and-so, who said this to so-and-so, who said this to so-and-so, who wrote it down. Okay? And some of those lines of transmission are considered not particularly trustworthy, either because they're extremely long and convoluted, or because there's somebody in the line that people said, don't trust him, So the hadith are taken with various grades of authority. And the Hanafi school said, the ones with a short transmission from Muhammad, and a trustworthy transmission, like Muhammad said to one of his wives this, she said it to so-and-so who wrote it down, take those. But the others, use your head instead. So, for example, the Qur'an forbids drinking alcohol and says, do not come to your prayers with a mind befuddled by drink. the Qur'an doesn't say anything about street drugs, but what would you think? Well, Abu Hanafi would say, well, don't come to your prayers with a mind befuddled, high either, or tripping. So we could use the analogy of alcohol to say something about not doing drugs as well. About 30 years later, we have a Maliki school, Malik bin Anas. He lived in Medina, and he emphasized using the consensus of the community of Medina, which would include the Qur'an, but he was not interested in using reason or analogical reasoning, and just said, if it's not in the Qur'an, what does the community do? What is the tradition? And so this group follows tradition, custom, what the community in Medina did. Okay, then we come to the Shafi'i school, and again, each of these schools is about a generation later. They're all about 30 years after the previous one. And the Shafi'i school emphasizes the hadith, sometimes even above the Qur'an, and says, use what's in the hadith. Even if it's the Qur'an, a life and example of Muhammad is the most important. So even the questionable hadith get emphasized by the Shafi'i. And then we go one more generation and we get to the Hanbali school. And the Hanbali school elevates the hadith above all other sources and adds new ones. Okay, and what are these new ones? These new ones return to many of the traditions that predated Islam. I call the Hanbali school the revenge of the Quraysh. They got back to where they were before. So you find things like, stoning women who have committed adultery creep back in under the Hanbali school, saying, well, that was our tradition. It doesn't matter what it says in the Qur'an. This is what we do. Okay, so the Quraysh finally get their revenge. I got a map here. You can see where the different schools are. And you can kind of think of the schools. I see them as getting further and further and further away from the Qur'an, away from the spirit of Muhammad, and more and more back to the old tribal customs of the Quraysh. So the green is the Hanafi school. So that was the first one that says, look at the Qur'an and use your head. And you can see that's Turkey, Upper Egypt. We find it in all of the stans that were in the former Soviet Union. We find it it was in Afghanistan, maybe not so much anymore, but in the Indian subcontinent, for example. And then up into Europe. I did a Fulbright in Sarajevo, and in Sarajevo they were clearly the Hanafi school. Okay, then the Hanbali school, which is the Revenge of the Quraysh, is the orange, and you see that really basically centered on what is now Saudi Arabia, the center of the Arabian Peninsula. The Maliki school spread across northern Africa. The Maliki school is probably the second most liberal after the Hanafi. And the Shafi'i school spread kind of down the east coast of Africa and into what is now Iraq and some parts of Iran. So that gives you just kind of a look, and you can almost guess by looking at the colors of that map where you're going to find a more liberal version of Islam and where you're going to find a harsher version of Islam. But the map is not quite accurate for reasons that I'm going to give you. And these reasons begin in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula with a guy named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who lives right around 1700. He lives in an area called the Najd. The Najd is right in the center of the peninsula. It's a desert. It's not a pretty sand desert. It's a rocky desert and extremely desolate. There's actually a picture of a part of the Najd in the bottom. You can see there's absolutely nothing growing there. It's just barren, harsh rock. And it's a harsh landscape that gives rise to a harsh man. Okay? Wahhab is a cleric. He decides that Islam has lost its way, that it needs to be reformed, and that he's the man to do it. He wants to take things back to this golden age of the rightly guided caliphs that wasn't actually so golden, but he wants to go back to that. And he believes that anyone who does not follow his strict version of Islam is a heretic. And he is the first Muslim to give the notion that if they don't believe your version, they are an infidel and can be killed. Okay? Well, he would have just been a scourge of the Najd, except that he makes an alliance with a tribe, the Al-Sauds. Okay? And this happens early 1700s. The Al-Sauds are the tribe that are based in an oasis called Riyadh, currently the capital of Saudi Arabia. And they are the tribe that is in charge of this oasis. They make this alliance because there are benefits to be seen on both sides. The Sauds are a strong, a very warlike tribe, and they give Wahhab the firepower he wants. They give him the firepower to actually go out and kill folks that aren't right believers. Okay, what about the Sauds? What do they get out of this? Well, what they get out of this is a religious pretext to raid their neighbors. Okay, they would love to raid their neighbors, but they've kind of been suffering under the idea that Muslims don't kill other Muslims, and Wahhab says, yes, but they're not real Muslims. So go ahead, get them. And we get a new understanding of warfare that comes out of this alliance. Again, this would probably only be a problem confined to parts of the Arabian Peninsula. They do sack Mecca. Okay, so the Sauds come storming down. They sack Mecca. You know, they even sack the Kaaba. And you must be thinking, why? Wait a minute, this is the center of their own religion. Why are they doing this? Okay, well, Wahhab was such a purist that he even believed that for Muslims to make the pilgrimage to the Kaaba was worshiping the Kaaba rather than worshiping God, and that this was a bad thing. So, you know, despite the fact that it's in the Qur'an to make this pilgrimage, it's one of the 5 pillars of the faith, but Wahhab said, nope, you're doing it all wrong, so don't do it at all, we're going to sack Mecca. Obviously, the Meccans don't take too kindly to this. They beat him back. Then he goes in the other direction and heads up towards the northeast and sacks Karbala, which is the center of Shiism. Okay, some of the things he doesn't like about Shiism, the Shiites are using pictures in their mosques and in their houses. Now, you may have noticed on some of the earlier slides, let me go back here, that, like here's the death of Muhammad, that you don't see any faces drawn in these Persian miniatures that I used. Okay, this is because Muhammad forbid the showing. First of all, he forbid there being a lifelike image of any animal or human inside a mosque. Because he said, you know, the proclivity of people to worship statues, we know all about that golden calf, you know, with Moses and all of that. So we just don't want any statues inside a mosque. That's why you will find abstract designs and calligraphy. The calligraphy says something about the Muslim understanding that the closest we get to God being present among us on earth is God's word. And so it's the word. God is made into word in the Qur'an. And I could say a little more about that. They actually believe that, they say that the Arabic in the Qur'an is extremely beautiful. I don't speak Arabic except for a few words, so I don't know that. And they say you can't really translate the Qur'an. Part of the reason is it's poetic, and you all know how hard it is to translate poetry, right? You can go for the poetic style, but you'll lose some of the meaning, or you can go for the meaning and you lose the poetry. So they say that's a problem. The other problem is they say this is the word of God, even the very sound of it is special. And if you translate it, you lose the sound. So that's why most Muslims try to learn enough Arabic to be able to read at least parts of the Qur'an in the original Arabic. And they say that if you translate it, it's not really the Qur'an. Often a translation will be called the meaning of the Qur'an, or the ideas in the Qur'an, or something like that, because they say, well, it's not really the Qur'an once you translate it. Anyway, that was kind of a off to the side. But so they sack Mecca, they sack Karbala. The other thing, you'll see some Sufi dancers in the middle. Wahhab believes that not only did the Shiites get things all wrong, but the Sufis got things even wronger. I mean, dancing, this isn't good. Plus, if you read the poetry of Rumi or Hafiz, it's full of allusions to drinking wine. Oh my gosh, that's forbidden in the Quran. And there also were practices. The bottom picture is actually the tomb of the Sufi poet Hafiz, who is probably my favorite poet. And when I was in Iran, I went to his tomb, and some of the people who were with me said, "Did you bring a copy of Hafiz along?" I said, yeah, I did. They said, "Okay, good. Go to the end, stand at the end of his sarcophagus, just kind of put your hand on it, and then open up your book, and he'll give you a message." And I thought, oh, well, okay, let's try it, tried it. I don't remember what the message was anymore. But, oh boy, I got back to the bus, and some of the Muslims were just freaking out. They're saying, this is soothsaying, it's divinization, it's totally, totally wrong. So there were practices of going to the graves of saints, and Wahhab didn't like that either. The analogy would have been, think of him as like one of the John Calvin or something, one of the strictest reformers of Catholicism, who are saying, get all those statues out of the church, and stop praying to saints. Often people say that the Shiites are the Catholics of the Muslim world, and that the Sunnis are the Protestants, in that sense of more austerity, in the Sunni version. Anyway, they get beaten back from there too, and kind of retreat back into the Najd. And that might have been the end of Wahhab and Wahhabism, except for this person. Okay, by now we go about 100 years later. And Wahhabism is sort of living on in Riyadh, kind of isolated in this oasis. And the person who comes to be the sheikh of the Al Saud tribe in Riyadh is Abdul Aziz bin Abdul Rahman Al Saud. That one just trips off the tongue. He's a really handsome guy, too. And he's up there. And he's born in 1880. So in 1914, he is 34, the prime of his manhood, in charge of this tribe, and he forms another alliance with who? Anybody? World War I. Lawrence of Arabia. Okay, Lawrence has been sent by the British to the Arabian Peninsula to see if he can get the tribes to rise up against the Ottoman Empire, who is part of the coalition that the British are fighting on the other side in World War I. He wants it to just be enough of a distraction, enough of a thorn in the side of the Ottoman Empire that it weakens the Ottoman Empire and it weakens the forces that they can bring to the European theater. Okay, Lawrence also decides that it would be important to try to unite the different tribes. And he is quite successful at it. And after he unites the different tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, who does he put in charge. His friend, Abdulaziz bin Abdul Rahman. Okay? And this is how the House of Saud becomes the monarchy of present-day Saudi Arabia. And, of course, they bring their strict Wahhabi version of Islam with them to the throne. Still, this wouldn't have been a big deal except for now a third thing that happens, and that is oil. Okay, the finding of oil in Saudi Arabia and the importance that this has first to Britain, but then to the United States, and the forming of the Arabian American Oil Company, currently Aramco. Okay, and we become the strongest allies of and protectors of the House of Saud. And they have a lot of money. What do they do with this money? Well, the first thing they do is decide they're going to live lavish playboy lifestyles. But that's not going to go over real well with these strict Wahhabi preachers, is it? So what do? You pay them off. Bribe the Wahhabi preachers, give them a lot of money, and say, leave us alone. And they do. Okay, now what do the Wahhabis do with all this money? They say, well, hey, yeah, we're going to go out, we're going to build schools and mosques, and we're going to spread the true faith. So, here's a quote from Bernard Lewis. Imagine if the Ku Klux Klan or the Aryan Nation obtained total control of Texas and had at its disposal all the oil revenues, and used this money to establish a network of well-endowed schools and colleges all over Christendom, peddling their particular brand of Christianity. This was what the Saudis have done with Wahhabism. Okay, and I've seen that in action. I started going to Bosnia shortly after the war there. During the war, about 87% of the mosques and 97% of the minarets in Bosnia were destroyed. Now, the West gave Bosnia aid to rebuild after the war, but we did not give them aid to rebuild mosques. Okay, they had to look elsewhere. So, you look at where the money is. The money was in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And so they took money to rebuild their mosques from those places. They got, unfortunately, some very ugly mosques in the bargain. They got mosques that would look beautiful in the desert but look really silly in the Bosnian mountains. But besides that, the money came with strings attached. And at the end of one of those strings was a Wahhabi cleric. In other words, they gave the money, but they said, we'll staff your mosque for you too. Here's your cleric. Here's your imam. And the change in the culture is amazing. Over about 15, 20 years, I just saw the fact that when I first went there, if you saw a woman wearing a scarf in Sarajevo, it meant she was like 85 years old and somebody's babushka, okay? Now you see a lot of women wearing the scarf, the headscarf. Now, they haven't gone to the full Saudi Arabian niqab that covers the bottom of the face, but you just see the change in the culture that this money and these schools can bring. And then think about places like Pakistan and Afghanistan. They built the madrasas there and staffed them as well. And in many of these places, poor farmers would send their sons to the madrasa for two reasons. The first reason, it's the only place they're going to get any kind of an education because there aren't schools in many of these areas. But the second and probably even more important reason, they're going to get fed. And, when you're that poor, you'll send your sons to get, 3 hots and a cot. Doesn't matter what they're being taught. They're being fed. And so this money, this oil money, and unfortunately we are very complicit in all of this because it's America that's been propping up the House of Saud, and buying their oil and being their allies. And so we are complicit in the spread of this version of Islam. Okay, now one of the questions you have to ask then is when you look at things that are happening in parts of the Middle East in particular, you have to ask the question, is it religious or is it cultural? Now, already you know part of what I think about a lot of these things. If you are part of this spread of Wahhabism and this Hanbali version taken to the extreme by Wahhab, but this version of Sharia, then first of all, you're spreading things under the name of Islam that are cultural, that went back to the old tribal practices of the Quraysh that were not part, in fact, were part of what Muhammad inveighed against, that do not follow the Qur'an. Okay, so I think much of this is cultural. A lot is also cultural in a more modern sense. I put up the picture, for example, of you can see the gentleman, he's kind of herding some veiled women. If you look at places like Afghanistan and the areas that are under the Taliban, you find that women are suddenly basically denied almost all of their rights. Now, these were rights that Muhammad gave his wives that are part of the Quran, part of the Hadith. Why are they doing this? Well, partly they're taught to do this by the Wahhabi clerics, but partly I think it's because for a man who's barely eking out a living in, some small village in Afghanistan, having women be socially lower than you are at least puts you above somebody. And that's important. That's just a cultural dynamic, that every group wants to feel that they are not the very bottom, that they are not the least powerful of all the groups. And so many things are cultural in that way as well. I want to point you towards a Gallup poll that was done about, it was published, I'd say, about 6 or 7 years ago. It's called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. And they covered just about every topic. They did 6 years of research with more than 50,000 interviews in 35 nations. So they talked to a lot of Muslims. And this is just a sampling of what they think in a certain political area. So the data reveal that Muslims are slightly more likely than Americans to reject attacks on civilians as morally unjustifiable. Large majorities of Muslims would guarantee free speech if it were up to them. What they least admire about the West is a perceived breakdown of traditional values, the same answer most Americans give. And when asked about their dreams for the future, Muslims say they want jobs and security, not conflict and violence. So you find that most Muslims want the same things most Americans want. They want just a safe place, a job that allows them to provide for their families and raise their children. So why ISIS? Okay, well, there are actually a couple of reasons. The first is there's a big youth bulge in the Middle East. Over 30% of the population is between 15 and 29. That's a huge number of young people. And these young people have very little opportunity. Okay, in Egypt, 26% of the youth are unemployed and 51% are living in poverty. In some other countries, those numbers are a bit better, say Turkey. In some countries, those numbers are quite a bit worse, like Algeria. You find there about a 55% youth unemployment. Okay? It's no better among those whose parents moved to Europe, who live in the suburbs or the banlieues around Paris or around Brussels. There you find about 40% youth unemployment and probably about 60% poverty. They often talk about the young people who leave to join ISIS from these areas and call them gangster jihadis. that these are young men who've been in and out of prison, usually for minor crimes. And one imam said, yeah, and they got a joint in one hand and a beer in the other. And they decide they're going to go join ISIS. Why? Well, there's nothing for them at home. They don't see a future at home. And ISIS hold out to them this idea of a utopian dream. And that's another thing we could say. Youth tend to be a lot more utopian. You know, when you get older, you get a little more practical. You realize that the utopian solutions you were sure were going to work aren't going to work, and that you need to change things incrementally. Youth are much more, you know, you say you want a revolution. So the media has not helped, okay? First of all, social media has not helped. It's allowed ISIS to get their message out much more broadly than they would if they had to depend on print media or anything like that, even radio. But the journalistic media has not helped either, because they tend to always go for the extremes. So, you know, we see this even in the reporting on Christianity, right? How often do they report on ordinary Christians? You know, not often, but as soon as Westboro Baptist Church is up to something, they're going to be on the front page. So you find that the media goes for the extremes. They're looking for conflict and trying to play it up. And so they have given ISIS a hell of a lot of free press that they wouldn't have otherwise had. Plus, the media likes conflict, so they like to depict this as a conflict between like ISIS and the West, and that plays right into ISIS's hands. ISIS wants us to believe that Islam and the West are implacable enemies, because as long as we believe that, we keep them going, because they feed off of conflict. And if we keep conflict going, they keep feeding. Okay, so the media has not been helpful. Social media, I already mentioned, that has not been very helpful. Also, they have an appeal with apocalyptic messaging. I mentioned earlier that they have their own version of Jesus' second coming in the Battle of Armageddon. They believe that they believe, first of all, that there will be a battle on the fields outside of this little Syrian town called Dabiq that will be between them and a coalition of 80 nations led by Rome. This is the prophecy. They say, well, who is Rome? Is it going to be the Vatican leading this? They say, well, let's just say the West, okay, or Christendom. So 80 nations led by Christendom will have this battle. And the Muslims, although they'll have terrible losses, a third of their forces will be killed, a third will flee, but the other third will finally be victorious. And they will move on and conquer Constantinople. Obviously, you can tell this was a prophecy that comes from the time of the Roman Empire, when the seat of the Roman Empire was Constantinople. And then they say Jesus will return, and he will lead the victorious Muslims and all of their converts in the final battle between good and evil, the final battle with the forces of the devil. And that will usher in, you know, heaven and the golden age. So it's a pretty similar story to our story of Armageddon. Some of the details have been changed. Apocalyptic imagery is strong. One thing that I think is good for diffusing this apocalyptic imagery is that Dabiq fell to Turkish fighters about 2 weeks ago. So ISIS is suddenly having to backpedal and say, well, that wasn't the real, fight outside of Dabiq. Yeah, that's still off in the future sometime. They've used this imagery so much that they named their English language magazine Dabiq. So that's a copy of one of their English language magazines. But they're not the only one using apocalyptic imagery. If you go out to more evangelical sites, Christian sites, you find them doing the same thing. And it's kind of interesting. I took that other picture. One of the sites said, well, it says in Revelations that we're going to fight, the enemy will be personified by a bear. And I remember when I was growing up in the 70s, reading The Late Great Planet Earth. And of course, it was the middle of the Cold War, and the bear was Russia, right? And so there was all this stuff about we're going to have a nuclear war with Russia, and that's going to be the Battle of Armageddon, and the world is coming to an end. And I was terrified, as a child. But so now they've said, well, if the caliphate expands to all the parts of the world that have at any time been Islamic, you get this picture, and hey, look at that, it's a bear. Huh, oh my gosh. Well, it's kind of funny, but it shows that both sides are using apocalyptic imagery. And it's because, again, perpetuating this idea of conflict wins them converts. It helps them along. Now, to end, there are two types of nostalgia. A book on the meaning of nostalgia by Svetlana Boym came out just a year ago. And she talks about these two types of nostalgia. She says there's personal nostalgia that we all experience, It's that feeling of remembering your childhood, remembering in a bit of a probably golden cloud, the way things were when you were growing up and didn't have all the cares and responsibilities of adulthood. It might be the nostalgia of the expatriate for the country of their origin. This kind of nostalgia we all experience, and it can be useful, helpful, if you don't just wallow in it all the time. But she said there's also a national kind of nostalgia. And this is the idealization of a former time when your group held more power. It's often the idealization of a time that never really was, but it becomes a bit of a fiction. We saw this in the wars in the former Yugoslavia with the idea that the Serbs had of a greater Serbia, and that there was a time when Serbia had this golden age that all Serbs lived together in one much larger country than Serbia now was, and they wanted to go back to that time. Usually this kind of nostalgia cloaks a naked power grab. And that's, it was used by Wahhab in the 1700s to say, we've got to go back to this really pure Islam. I'll tell you what that purity was, by the way. And this was when Islam had its golden age. It's being used by ISIS now in saying, we're reestablishing the caliphate. We're bringing Islam back to that golden age of the four rightly guided caliphs. And it's basically just a guise that is used on top of what is a power grab. And it's a power grab by, in Iraq at least, largely disaffected young people who see their country in chaos and don't see a lot of opportunity. And also people who were in the military when the military was disbanded by George Bush during the beginning of the Iraqi war and the whole de-Baathification of Iraq. Suddenly we had a whole class of military and political leaders who were out of a job, had nothing to do. And they were regrouping and basically saying, we're going to get the power back. What seems to be working right now is to simply do it under a religious guise, a religious cloak. So, I want not to leave you with that at the end, but to leave you instead with one of the Sufi poets, Rumi, who says, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make sense. Not quite the jihad we think about. Okay, we're going to have some time for questions, but before that I'm just going to have up here my contact information so that if we don't get to your question and you still have a burning question, you can email me and let me know. I also want to point out Oh, there's also a link to my homepage. And at the very bottom, there's a link to avonhillsalon.com. 6 of us who teach here at St. John's and the College of St. Benedict have started a blog. We call it Thoughts from the Avon Hills, and you find us at avonhillsalon.com. And we are writing about different things that are current, different things that are happening in the world today. We've got a political scientist, Jim Reed. We've got a historian in our chair of critical thinking, Nick Hayes. We have the chair of our environmental studies department, me, and one of our foremost economists, Louis Johnston. Both Nick and Louis you may have heard speak. They speak frequently on NPR. So I just wrote a piece last week on Dabiq and apocalyptic imagery. If you want to read more on that, there's something up there. I'll be writing, all of us will be writing on some thoughts about the election that we just had. And we'll all be writing about a whole variety of topics. So take a look sometime. Okay, now I think we have, how long do we have, Grace? About 20 minutes or so for questions. So what questions do you have? Okay, right in front.
Isn't Assad of the Wahhabi sect or not?
Okay, Assad from Syria, is he a Wahhabi? Actually, he isn't. He is an Alawite, which is a sect of Shiism, and we didn't go into all the Shiite sects because there wasn't time for that. Okay, yes?
There's such a conflict out between Shiitism and Sunnism. Tell us a little bit.
Okay, yeah, there's a conflict between the Shiites and the Sunnis. There always has been. Okay, as you know, of course, it started in conflict of who would be Muhammad's successor. Okay, it continued. The actual split happens after Ali is assassinated. And we find that this periodic conflict between the two groups is nonstop. It simply continues through history. So when after the Shiites split off, the grandson of Muhammad, so Ali's son, Hussein, and his 2 sons are fleeing to the northeast up towards the area in Iraq, and they are actually attacked by the Sunnis, and they are killed, they are martyred, and they are revered by the Shiites as martyrs of this cause, and and as the grandsons and great-grandsons of Muhammad, Hussein and his 2 grandsons. This conflict is pretty much continual. And I think one of the sad things that we didn't realize as Americans when we went into Iraq and we said, well, we'll just give them democracy, is that we were walking right into this conflict. That the Ba'athist Party had been dominated by a Sunni minority in Iraq. And then to suddenly say, well, now we're going to just give you all a vote for your leader, flip things, put the Shiites in charge, and the Shiites wanted revenge. They had been a persecuted minority for so long that they finally said, okay, good, now we're the majority. These wonderful Americans have put us in charge, and now we're going to persecute the Sunni minority. And so it just flipped. And I think it's really odd that our military leaders and our political leaders had no idea that there was this split between Sunnis and Shiites, and they had no idea what the consequences would be of what they were doing because they didn't know enough about this religion. So it's really important for people to learn something about Islam. If this interested you at all, I'd really suggest that you look at the book list that's out there, maybe find something to read to carry your knowledge further, because we Americans have been so woefully ignorant of this religion, and it has political ramifications. Yeah, back there.
Talk about the effect of the Shah of Iran and our role in that whole scenario.
Oh gosh, that could be a whole nother talk. Iran, yeah, it's a huge mess. No. What happened in Iran was that Iran has oil, okay? And Iran decided to go democratic. And they elected a democratic government. And the first thing that the leader of their democratic government and their parliament decided to do was to nationalize the oil fields in Iran. These oil fields had been basically, were basically the playground of Britain and America, British and America oil companies. Okay, when they nationalized the oil, the CIA engineered a coup, and we deposed the democratically elected government of Iran and put the Shah in place. And that started the problems in Iran. The Shah was a merciless dictator, and his secret police were very bad. The people rose up against that and chose a sort of messianic preacher, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in exile, to be their next leader. And then we see the flip from monarchy to theocracy. But, it's pretty hard to say what would have happened in Iran had we allowed democracy to continue in that country. We didn't, unfortunately. Yes, over here.
Does the head covering that women wear give them a certain prestige or power in the community?
Okay, does the head covering that women wear give them a certain prestige or power in the community? That varies from community to community. Again, how women dress in Islam is culturally dictated, not religiously dictated. You saw from what's in the Qur'an that there wasn't much there. And it basically enjoins modesty on both men and women. So how women dress is culturally determined, so that in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, where you have the Hanbali school, women are generally either totally covered or they wear the niqab, which covers the lower half of the face, so that only the eyes are allowed to be seen. In many other places, women just wear a headscarf. And the scarf, too, can be different. In Iran, as I pointed out, women will push the envelope, try to just wear a light little scarf and show some hair, and get in trouble for it, societally. Benazir Bhutto, you might remember pictures of her in Pakistan. She was a Muslim, and she always just wore a little gauzy thing. It was more of a symbolic scarf, than a real scarf draped over her head, and looked very elegant in it. So it varies from country to country and culture to culture. Yes?
That part of the country is considered the birth of Christianity. And at one time, like Syria, was almost 100% Christian. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure they didn't volunteer to leave.
Okay, yeah. At one point, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, there were a lot of Christians in these areas. Also in Iraq, there were quite a few Christians. But what has happened is that in most of these places, the Christians have left. It's easier for Christians to assimilate in the West. Also, we find in places like among the Palestinians, the Christians tended to be the higher class or better educated the people than the Arabs, and so they had more opportunity to leave. We find now in Iraq there are very few Christians remaining. And I think we're going to find the same thing in Syria. And unfortunately, the monasteries in Syria have been targeted by both sides. but particularly by ISIS. So Christians are not faring well, and most of them are trying among those great waves of refugees, heading into Europe. Yes?
I'd like to do a follow-up on that question. Our religious freedom is one of our most cherished freedoms, and it seems like when Muslims are in the minority, they really insist on freedom to evangelize and practice their religion. And yet in countries where they're in a majority, they refuse to allow Christianity to build churches or, as you've experienced, to carry a rosary or a Bible. What are we to make of that? And I've read one of our concerns is demographically, like in England and France, where there have been many Muslim immigrants, within a generation, they will be in the majority. So Christianity will not be permitted.
Okay, it's actually way more complex than that. The country that has the strictest rules against prohibiting other religions is, as you would expect, Saudi Arabia. Okay, our allies. In many other countries, the rules really are not that strict. And in fact, the largest population of Muslims lives in Indonesia, not in the Middle East at all. And they allow other faiths to survive. So where it's not true that wherever there's a Muslim majority, they don't allow other faiths. Even in Iran, they do allow other faiths. There are Christian churches in Iran. There are still Zoroastrian temples in Iran that I visited. There are synagogues also. So it's not really true that they forbid other faiths. And we certainly have found that there were Christians in Iraq, there were Christians in Syria, in Jordan, in Palestine. And, we tend to think of all Palestinians as Muslims. It's not true. A lot of them were Christians. And they actually ran into more restrictions on their faith that were imposed on them by the Jews, by the Israelis. Than by their fellow Muslim Palestinians. Same thing in Europe. Often politicians have talked about, there are already no-go zones in London or in Brussels or places where the police won't go. That is absolutely not true. If you talk to the politicians and the police in those countries, they said, I don't know where they got that idea. It's just not true. So, nor is it true that Muslims will become the majority. It's a fear, and it's a fear that is propagated by the right-wing political parties that we find gaining strength in some of these Muslim countries. But Muslims still remain a pretty, a sizable minority, but very much a minority in all of these countries. Okay, up over here.
During the political campaign, we heard many times, Donald Trump asserting that lack of action by Barack Obama and current leadership led to the expansion and, further development of ISIS. What is your feeling about that, or your opinion about that assertion?
Okay, what is my opinion about the assertion that lack of action by Barack Obama led to the development of ISIS? First of all, the development of ISIS, as I already said, has its roots in the Iraqi war and our policies of disbanding the military. And you can say, well, yeah, but the military, they were our enemies. But generally, then, okay, you disband at the top, but you don't disband the whole thing, the whole rank and file, many of whom were not particularly our enemies. They were just recruits. Okay. Now, could Barack Obama have moved more aggressively against ISIS? It's very difficult to do. Okay, you could, as Trump says, I'm just going to bomb the hell out of them. Well, you're going to kill a lot of civilians if you do. ISIS is a minority in many of these towns that they have taken control of. You can flatten the town, but you're going to kill a small bit of ISIS and a lot of civilians. And I think that was something Obama did not want to do. He's too much of a humanitarian to do that. The other thing is it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole, you know? Okay, you can whack them here, but they're going to pop up over there. And especially the more we assert our Western force, the more we play into ISIS playbook, you know, of this is a fight between Islam and the West. Far better for ISIS to be confronted by the Muslim communities that they are trying to subjugate, and for those communities to throw them off. That way they don't have the advantage of this narration that says we're fighting for our faith. You know, they hate us for our religion. And so, you know, is ISIS dangerous? Yes. Are they going to go away? Eventually, yes. Are they going to go away quickly? No. Could we have made them go away quickly? I really doubt it. Not without a huge amount of collateral damage. Yes. Well, very sad. Yeah, we didn't provide the security that we needed to do. We made a lot of let's just say mistakes were made, okay? And that we're still in that war. You know, that war has not ended. And ISIS is just another manifestation of that. It's a manifestation that has, you know, gone under more of a religious guise, but it's really just a part of that same war. Okay, way in the back. Yeah, what is the appeal of ISIS to young people here? And especially, you know, we've had some young people from the Somali community in Minneapolis that have gone to ISIS. I think it's the same as many of the things that I already mentioned. I think that many of these young men, and there have been some young women too, feel isolated from the larger community, ostracized from the larger community, feel that they have very small economic opportunities ahead of them. And a lot of it is just the glow of youth, the idealism of youth. You know, as I mentioned, the utopian ideas that all of us tend to have when we're young, that I want to make my life worthwhile by giving it to a cause where I can really make a difference and where I can bring about a more utopian community. And ISIS has really presented itself as a utopian vision in the social media. You know, that we've reestablished the caliphate, that you will be welcome among us, that you will have a wonderful life, we will find you a wife, we will find you a job, we will give you really meaningful work to do in bringing the kingdom of God about on earth. It's just a message that idealistic and disaffected young people relate to. Many of them, most of them, find out later that obviously it was about a big lie and that it's not so good. Right now, ISIS has been losing territory somewhat rapidly. This is a help because as long as they were able to say that they were expanding, they could give this vision. You know, it's pretty hard when you're contracting and you're not doing well. So that I think we're finding that the numbers of youth who are attracted to ISIS now is diminishing quite a bit. And there's a trial going on right now in Minneapolis of those young men who are saying we were tricked into this, we really didn't believe it, be lenient, and it'll be up to the the judge to decide how much they were tricked or how much they really believed. But my guess is that an awful lot of young people, just they let their idealism run away with them. Okay, let's see. Someone who hasn't asked a question. Here.
Yes, I'm wondering about the persons that put a bomb upon their person and go into martyrdom.
Nice.
What's the background on that?
Okay. Yeah, what about martyrdom and suicide bombing? What's the background to that? The background to that is that there are verses in the Qur'an that talk about martyrs being blessed. They come out of this time of the Meccan War, and I think they are a way of saying, those who fought and died, our loved ones, they'll go to paradise. Okay, so it comes out of that time period and that saying. Often people talk about a particular verse that says that if a warrior is martyred, he will be given, 70 virgins in paradise. Okay, this verse is controversial in a couple of ways. Okay, the first way is that when paradise is talked about in the Quran, it's described, it's like, think about the person who's living in the desert, and what would be their fantasy of paradise. Okay, lots of water, right? It's described with rivers and fountains and lots of fruit and lots of flowers and all the things that are scarce in the desert. And then it's also described as a place of happiness and pleasure. And so there are places where they say, for one thing, in Islam, sex isn't bad. Sex is considered to be a very good thing. There are none of those overtones of sex being sinful in Islam that you find creep into Christianity. And so they say, and people will be having sex in paradise. It's going to be great. So there are verses like that. A lot of it, scholars, and Islamic scholars as well, say this is just symbolic. We don't know what paradise is going to be like. It's just a way of saying, think about the greatest place and the greatest time you could have here on earth. And we're just saying it's going to be pretty great. That's all. It's symbolic. The other thing is, remember I talked about these consonants, and how you put different vowels in, you get a whole constellation of words? Well, the Quran, when it was originally written down, didn't put in the vowels because it was meant to be an aid to memory, not a book that you sit down and silently read. In fact, the Quran at its best is not read silently by believers, it's chanted. And when the Quran is read in a mosque, it's chanted. And so what they were putting down were the consonants as aids to teaching and to memory. And it's only in later editions that the vowels are put in. So some scholars, and I'll kind of end with this, it's a bit of a joke, and you could take it as lightly or not as you want, have said, well, if you change the vowels there, they're actually going to get 70 raisins. And maybe 70 raisins. And maybe it's part of this whole, saying in paradise there's so many flowers and fruit trees and stuff, and you're going to get a lot of fruit. And I'm thinking there are going to be some really disappointed young men who arrive at paradise and they say, okay, here's your box of raisins. Okay, on that I'm going to give the microphone over to Grace, who has a few things she'd like to share with you.